So I might get Andrew Mulligan to come up, just have a quick chat about animal health issues transitioning into, I guess, a change of feed. So we're going from, summer feed into high quality feed. So we'll have a bit of a chat about drenches and vaccinating and things like that. And obviously, with making a lot of silage this year and things like that because it's been available, some issues around botulism and whatnot. And yesterday Andrew drew a very average cow to do his demonstrations on, so we've Mr. Squiggle over here is going to draw, I don't know what that is, but yeah, that's a cow anyway. So it's got a front and a rear, that's all we need to know, and some stomachs.
So before I say anything about the cow, I want to just touch on vaccinating. How many of you vaccinate for 71 once a year, and that's pretty much your vaccine? That's what we do for vaccines? Yep. Right. So we've been talking about different pastures, silage, things like that. I would keep that 7-in-1 once a year, but in doing that, I would also add a 5-in-1 probably every 3 months around that year back to that 7-in-1. We're talking different, every time we change that pasture going into the rumen, we are seeing more and more spores grow in the rumen from that change of rumen. Now, when we know that it takes about 14 days for that rumen to change to different feed conditions, when you first put them into a paddock, it goes straight out the back of them. The microbes aren't there. It's not making the protein like to be synthesised in the abomination, and it's just flowing through them for the first couple of weeks when you put them on a new one. That's when the danger period is for pulpy kidney. Now, with other things like a ligament oedema and things, that's, a cold can cause that. And it gets on the lungs, bang, gone again. So 5-in-1, it's bloody cheap. Just, every sort of 3 months, whack it in. Doesn't matter if you're a dairy or beef situation. How many people feed silage? Pretty much everyone would have silage or hay or things like that in your systems.
Or grain.
Or grain. Extra feeding grain, pulpy kidney, really bad. One that's worse is botulism. Now, I haven't talked about botulism. We don't normally talk about it in beef games. In the dairy, we've been talking about it probably for the last 4 years. We've had some significant deaths over these years from that. Anyone spreading foul manure, same thing. If there's bones there and there's bone marrow present, botulism can survive. And it is the deadliest disease known to man. You won't see it coming. Half your herd will be gone overnight. So it's about $1.50 to $1.60 a dose for a 1-year shot. And, you guys all pay insurance on your sheds and cars and things like that. It's the best insurance policy you'll ever get against botulism.
We did the math on it yesterday.
Yeah.
What are you getting botulism?
Well, we have a product called Synvac 1 year, so it's one shot. Now, with dairy farmers, you've also got to think about when you're going to do it, because we are putting the deadliest disease known to man into an animal. Okay, it's a dead vaccine, but there's going to be an antibody response, and that's what we want. So the first thing you're going to notice in a dairy situation is milk drop. In a steer or a cow situation, you are going to see a couple of kilos lost in that initial first week. It'll take about 4 days for them to get over that shot. It's like us when we get a vaccine. Our arm hurts, we can feel a little bit crook for a little while from a flu vaccine or something like that, but we get over it very quickly. And that's the whole point of a vaccine. With your 5-in-1s and 7-in-1s, we see the same thing. People just don't measure it. People say, oh, it's the stress of the yards and things like that, but it's actually that immune response kicking in, and that's what we want. Now, a lot of you I know, I've seen you before in this room, multi-min with a vaccine, perfect. I mean, with our bovilus vaccines and things like that, we don't have bovilus vaccines, by the way, but we've actually seen 180% higher titer response when that multi-min is used at the same time as that bovilus vaccine. So it just, and with multi-min evolution now, which is the new multi-min, it's got a 23% higher zinc level, and zinc is the biggest carrier. It's doing the heavy lifting for your immune system, and that's what's really helping that new multi-min. But now I'll just focus on this a little bit. Does everyone know the 4 stomachs of an animal? Of a cow? Go on, we know a few of them. Rumen, that's the big one, isn't it? So from the mouth down, there's your reticulum. So, animals chewing their cud. Do we know why they do that? So you get big plants and hay and things like that. It actually takes longer for that stuff to get in the rumen because they sit down, they get a belly full, and what they've got to do is then go and bring it back up, chomp it all back up so it's small enough to be able to get into the rumen. You don't see big bits of stuff in the rumen, it's all small stuff. If you cut an animal open, it's all chopped up. Looks like chaff. So that's what they do when they go and sit down, they're chewing their cud and they're not eating. So, you hit a nice little green pasture with, high ME and things like that, it's going to go basically straight into the rumen. You won't see them chewing cud. As soon as they're into that stalky kikuyu and things like that, they'll sit down for half an hour, chewing their cud to be able to get it actually into the rumen before they can actually start processing it.
I'm just going to step in there quickly. So if we do a quick talk on, say, kike, I think it's 10 to 12 hours through the system, Josh, is it?
Yeah.
We talk about
Yep.
something like chicory, clovers, ryegrass. Well, chicory and clovers, a couple of hours. So we come back to that concept of it's hot, dry, well, hot and humid. You got 2 hours to go eat. Think about what they want to eat. So something that can go through and be processed, turned into beef or milk quicker, versus that obviously concept. So keep that always in the back of your head. Ryegrass and other things sit in between that in terms of
But
digestion
that also
time.
depends on the digestibility of the cake and everything else.
100%.
Quality of it.
100%.
Like I said,
that
your
comes back
nice
to
green.
everything we said before.
What we've
is
been saying before
quality.
about that nice green flushing kikuyu that you've got a high ME in it, beautiful, goes straight into the rumen, doesn't take much chopping up. You hit that stalky stuff, hours. So you're losing weight gain while they're sitting down, hoofing it up, or you're going to lose milk production. So, is there any worms in here? In the rumen? No. No worms survive in here, in this situation. There's a little stomach, which is the true stomach, off that, which is called the abomason. Now, the abomason, this guy's job is only just to process the food you're putting in and make proteins. All these proteins and sugars and carbs go into here. Some have actually taken in from the abomason, like your carbs and your sugars, they go straight in. Your proteins are then synthesised here to be able to be digested through the small intestine. And then it goes into the large bowel. So, we've got a totally clean animal. Where do worms come from if you put them on a totally clean paddock? Anyone know? They still come from here. Because most of our worms that we're not measuring or we are measuring are actually might be sitting in there at what we call an L4 stage, or in the case of Osteotarsia, inhibited in the side. When they come out, when the conditions are right, when the right food's going down here, when they know the right temperature and rainfall events happen out here, they take about 24 hours to turn around, become into adults, and then they punch out all the eggs down on here, down in their poo. So, going back, we've got a nice big pasture. So animal eats the pasture, where in the first 5 to 10 centimetres, that's where all your larvae are. So going back to here, those eggs, if the conditions are right, will hatch out in about 24 hours. If it's too dry, hot, cold, they'll die within that first 24 hours. So as soon as they hatch out, they'll die. If conditions are right, which is pretty much conditions are right here nearly 12 months of the year for both the major species, they will turn into larvae. And the larvae just sit in little water droplets in here, down here, in the soil, depending on where the rain is. They can move up through the water droplets, but they only get to about that first 5 centimetres to 10 centimetres.
Time from coming out and then to the larvae where they can move to pasture or move in the water?
About 48 hours, 24 to 48 hours really. So that's what we call an L3 stage. Then they're ingested here, come down as L3 and sit in here at L4. Now, an adult is an L5, so it's laying eggs. Do we know what worms are normally found in the abomason? Anyone know some worms? Osteotarsia. They inhibit at their immature stage. Anyone else for another one? Caperia, no. I'll explain Caperia in a minute. The big one here, and we're seeing a lot, Jimmy Kerr's been doing a lot of work with it, and Jesus, yeah, been annoying me pretty well with it, is Barber's poleworm. Does anyone know why it's called a Barber's poleworm? Its scientific name is Homunculus placei. In sheep it's called Homunculus contortus, in cattle it's called Homunculus placei. But it's called a Barber's poleworm because it basically looks like a barber's pole. One side's its guts from sucking blood, the other side's its eggs, and it lays a hell of a lot of eggs per day. And that's why it's called a Barber's poleworm. We always hear Barber's poleworm in sheep. We're starting to hear a lot more about it in cattle. And there's a reason for that too. With Ostatagia, we know that's a really bad worm in this area. They sit in that abomason. When conditions are right, they all bust out. Now, the abomason is like the true stomach. It absorbs your sugars and carbs and things like that. And it's got a nice little filly and things like that. When the Ostatagia get in, they inhibit in there. It actually stops it being digested through there. It stops the synthesisation of proteins that are going to be absorbed back through the small intestine. So it causes huge weight losses, especially in younger stock. Barber's poleworm, they sit here and they suck blood and they lay eggs, and that's all their job is. So if you measured, say, 1,000 eggs per gram out the back end of, say, a weaner, basically they're losing a stubby a day of blood. So that it'll fight it, generally won't die, but it's using all that energy to create more blood and to fix the problem rather than put on weight. And Barber's poleworm we've always thought of as a summer worm, but in this area with the daily temperatures we've got through winter and things and the wet and things, it's becoming an all year round worm. But one of the problems is, for years we've been drenching during the winter, autumn, winter, for this sucker, this Ostatagia, which is really bad, and we want to get that inhibited stage before they bust out. We want to kill it so it doesn't bust out and cause massive bleeding on the abomason. But because we've been doing that, we haven't worried about these little fellas. And these little fellas, Barber's poleworm, have built up in numbers on our pasture for years, unchecked, because Barber's poleworm love warm, wet weather. What happens here in summer? Warm, wet weather, storms, irrigation, things like that. So those numbers, punching out a few thousand eggs per day coming out the back end, it doesn't matter whether you're weaners or cows, still the eggs come out. Now we hear that cows, what was the one, they build a resistance to worms. And one of the resistance they build is they suppress egg laying of the worms. So cows are really hard to take a fecal egg count because they might punch out 10,000 eggs today and nothing tomorrow or the next day, and then another 10,000 eggs. So they're still contributing to these guys and these guys on your pasture. So if you're sending in weaners and then cows, and the cows are picking up all those worms, and they're pooping out eggs as well, in your rotation, what's going to happen when your weaners come back? They're going to hit this and get a hell of a lot of worms in them and cause weight loss. So it doesn't matter if it's not going to kill the cow or even knock back its reproductive cycle. We can work with that. We can work with a lot of things. But what about the weaners? Just because it's not hurting that cow as much as a weaner, it's still contributing to the fact that you're going to be punching all those eggs onto that pasture for your next time. Now, we used to say in parasitology, Barber's poleworm lasts for 3 months on the pasture. They're up to 8 months now. And we don't actually know how long they can last in the right conditions. So it's something to keep in mind. We always sort of autumn or winter drenching. We've got to be starting to look at a spring, summer drenching. We really do. But drench with the right product. A lot of times we've gone chasing lice with mectins, which is a broad spectrum drench, not knowing what the worms are in there. If we drench on a low population of worms, our resistance actually, we get more resistance quickly than if you drench on a high population of worms. So our overuse of mectins, we're seeing so much resistance, especially to these guys, because we're drenching at the wrong time of year. So we're taking out a small population which has built up that resistance over the years. And why are we drenching with a mectin? Because it's bloody easy and we take out lice with it. And it's generally through the winter months where the Barber's pole aren't as active And that's why we're seeing so much resistance, especially in Barber's pole. And we're actually not seeing as much resistance in Ostatagia. In fact, we can't really find many at all against mectins. And that's probably in this sort of area because we've got another problem called liver fluke. So we drench with things like called white drenches. So your old oxfendazole mixed with a tribendazole, it's very good at taking out inhibited Ostatagia. And you're using a dual active chemical. So last August, we actually put out a brand new chemical called Silage Platinum. So we've still got Silage, but we've also got, which is moxidectin, which is the active, but we've also got levemazole. And we didn't just go willy-nilly and throw them in the same drum. We used a product called Demisorb, which is now, it takes it in 23% faster. So it actually goes in at a much more potent thing. Now, it's the... Only at dry off. At dry off you can. So you can still use a dual active then at dry off. Now, when I say these things, it's not just because I'm promoting my products. I want people to use different actives. I want you to use levemazole. I want you to, and I've been saying this for years, and you guys know, our options were an oral levemazole or an oral oxfendazole. And I've been saying, please use it. A lot of people won't do oral. So even with our Silage long acting, which Bryce uses quite effectively, don't you, Bryce? Because we've probably knocked a fair bit of this, and you're withholding periods. Withholding periods because you're actually getting them off quicker, and yeah. But with Silage long acting, we do a lot of oral drench at the same time. And it's called a primer dose. So we're still using a really high potency mectin, but we use a primer dose with something like an oxfendazole. So we're actually using a dual active drench at the same time.
We do a white and a mectin.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that has kept that Ostatagia from actually becoming a resistance because we've been using dual actives in this area for a long time in that sort of thing. Now, Capiria, we mentioned that before. Capiria actually inhibit the first 6 metres of the small intestine. Does anyone know how long the small intestine is? There's 60 metres of small intestine. So they inhibit the absorption from protein for the first 6 metres. So they're not what we call a production limiting worm because you've got so many more metres for those proteins to be absorbed. Where that is wrong is in a small animal, because remember when it's a small animal, this rumen isn't big, it's quite small. The abomasum is the true stomach because those little villi take in the milk and the proteins from the milk, so things are absorbed there. And the small intestine is probably only about 8 or 9 metres long. They're not born with that. That grows as they come up and out of milk. This one shrinks, and that one gets a lot bigger. And that's how it changes. So definitely, these are what we call production limiting worms. They're the ones that stop reproductive cycles or growth. So my best bang for the buck, and you probably heard me say this before, if you're going to do one treatment on a cow a year, when's the best time to do it? Prior to calving. Go in a month before or prior to calving. Because this little calf sitting in here, and my pen's gone. Little calf in there, he sits there and just grows. These are great. So he just sits in, a little calf sitting in there. He sits in there and the cow does all right through the year and just pokes along. In the last trimester of pregnancy, he grows to 70% of his size. So what's that doing to the cow? She's pumping everything she's got into growing that calf out in that last trimester. So we want to take out all the worms at that time so that she's got more energy. We also want to be putting in, and I'll say I'd mould him in. We should be putting that in a month prior to calving because she's pumping those minerals into that calf. I mean, you see a calf born, it's so black and shiny, or, if it's a red and white, the red's really red and the white's really white. You can see it in the calf when they're first born because she's pumped every bit of mineral that cow's got into that calf. By 3 months, that calf's running out and you can see them wooden off, and that's basically because they've run out of trace elements. Cows are the same. So if they've punched all that into them, she will regain her mineral status just by grazing and things over a certain time, but it might take another cycle or another bit of length of time. So instead of that cow going back into reproductive status so quickly, it might be the second cycle or third, what you're saying, but she didn't really cycle on that first one because the minerals aren't there. So you thump in a multi-min prior to calving and a vaccine, because as she's throwing all that, her immunity drops. Immunity is dropping out of the world. So we want to get as much vaccine into that calf as possible, and we want to get as much into the cow so she doesn't actually die from a clostridial disease or something like that. So that's where I'd be doing my 7-in-1 a month prior to calving. I know generally we do it at marking because we're doing the calves at marking, but I think that pre-calving is the best time to do it. And yeah, we're taking those worms out of the equation so that she's got no problems about getting energy into her before she calves. Is there any questions, guys, on anything that I've talked?
Is there a problem with doing 7-in-1 you off together?
No. Probably a bit higher milk drop. You might lose a little bit more over those days. I know a few dairies that actually do it at dry off, so you're not actually losing that milk production. But then I said that to a group of dairy farmers over in Gloucester the other day, the big 5 over there, and they said, hell no. I said they'll take the milk drop for 4 days, 5 days, because they want to make sure their whole herd's done on that day every year. Because, you know, you go and dry off a batch, and you go, oh shit, I haven't got any bloody botulism vaccine. Oh, they'll be right. So you don't know.
We found it easier too. Like ideally, if you could guarantee every dry-off is going to be an easy day, and you could do it, but just
Exactly. You don't know if you're drying off 10 or 12 or 20 or 30.
The other thing is that not all cows do a 300-day lactation, so
Exactly. You could be 18 months out.
100-day lactation is not getting done.
Yeah, you could be 18 months out before it actually gets its 1 year. And we've got a 3-year botulism vaccine, which we use in the northern Australia, and that's because there's more pressure up there. So the animals that are exposed to the disease are a lot higher. So the antibody build-up's a lot. It's been challenged so that they actually build up a higher antibody so that they can actually go 3 years without getting another vaccine. But down here, we're not being challenged all the time. We're only being challenged really hard once, or once every 10 years, or once every 3 years. And you're not going to get that antibody level for that 3-year mark.
So you're basically saying, a month before calving, we've got 7-in-1, we've got multi-min, we've got a drench, and you've got your botulism.
You're going to do one time a year.
And is that, I mean, is that too much? I mean, that seems a lot for the cow.
I can tell you now, I've got clients that will throw a 3-day in there and they'll throw a B12 and an 18E. So they're pink cushion by the end of the day, so no.
But, and I see the worst thing, we're always trying to rush cattle work. Like, how much is a steer worth these days?
100 kilos, $750.
What about a finished?
Finished, 2 gram.
Exactly. So if you rush them through the yards, you have a bit of an accident, you get a bad injection site because you've rushed it and things like that, and you get things on it, and that animal, say it dies, because the vaccine didn't actually take up better because you've rushed it, you've just jammed it in rather than tending the skin and getting it in there properly. You've just lost $2,000. You could have hired a bloke for 3 weeks to do that cattle work. You've got to start thinking about this. We've got to slow things down and do it properly. So if we've got to do multiple injections, drenches, things like that on the day, slow it down. Don't bring in them all in the one day and try and get through them on the one day.
So are you recommending that to all the beef fellas to tent the skin every time? Like we do
Every time.
We do with our dairy cows, but I just know most beef fellas just...
No, they just go along the race, bang, 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 bang. Every time you do that, you open yourself up for an infection. Change needles regularly. As soon as you've got to push that needle through the skin, if it's a little bit harder, change the bloody needle. Because that's every time that needle gets blunt, you could be taking in dust fragments, disease on the skin, things like that. Try not to do wet animals. Wet animals actually, all those dust fragments and things become a lot more mobile. So when you inject them, they actually go into the skin a lot easier. Yeah, you'll get side infections and, oh, it's bloody awful. Infections here, there. You know, if you've got side infection, do you know that that vaccine has actually worked properly?
We actually had a reaction to the botulism. The one we used, I told you about, Cole. The one we used last year, I think, was a different brand to the one the year before or something or other. We just got more swelling like in the cow.
You'll get with botulism, I mean, it mightn't be a site reaction as in it's not working. It might be a site reaction because it's one of those bloody diseases that just, you know, it's there. So it might blow out as a lesion or anything. But you'll see that, you know, golf ball sort of thing. Even when you rub it, it'll come up a day later.
They were swollen up between the front legs, some of them.
Yeah, some of them do it. Because, I mean, remember, it's the deadliest disease known to man. So, you know, we whinge and bitch about a flu needle because we get sore and redness and things like that and we get a bit fluey. Botulism and the flu are at two different ends of the scale. Like, botulism's that.
And unfortunately, botulism, and you know, anyone in the dairy game probably knows, you know, the case down the south coast in the last 3 years, like it's not one or two animals and you go, oh, it's not like, you know, polycidney or black leg or something like that, that you go, you wake up in the morning and there's 50 cows dead, or your whole herd. Like it's not, and generally that's because the source is throughout a feed mix, or it's come through your cups, through your, you know, feed distribution, through the bales. Like it's not a, yeah, unfortunately it's not.
Very bad. Like,
You know, one rat, dead rat, that was dead last night, and he's sort of half decomposed by now or fallen down through the feeder. The cups just take it along and drop it to every bloody cow in the...
We're talking one of the best, you know, stud herds in Australia.
The people send stud cows to,
couple hundred.
200 and something.
Yeah.
overnight, bang, gone, dead.
It's not the first one down there that's happened like that.
But there's one that was up in Lismore about 6 or 7 years ago. That was cup feeders. Dropped it, he had milk and 120. He was left with 30.
Chicken litter up the coast, Taree, a few years ago. I think there was 80 or so died, botulism.
There was even one about 8 years ago from a feed mill that went through to a dairy on a buried there. So.
The thing is that the actual disease lives in the marrow. That's why we see a lot of cases up in North Queensland, because North Queensland is really phosphorus deficient, so animals chew bones. As soon as they break through that bone and hit that marrow, bang. You know, the botulism's there. Birds can carry it from the animal to the water source, you know. It's...
Do they only need the one shot, or are you going to give them a booster as well?
We have 3 different botulism vaccines. We've got what we call a DC, so it's a one shot, and then you've got to come back in and do like a normal vaccine 4 to 6 weeks later. Yep. Or you've got Synvac 1 year. I wouldn't do at all. Wouldn't even recommend Synvac 3 year down here because we're not challenged. Synvac 1 year, it's just one shot. So no booster. It's just that annual shot. And the first year, it's still that annual shot. Oh, and with vaccines, I can't stress how important it is, like in your normal vaccine, when you do the first shot, 4 to 6 weeks later. If you've gone anything over sort of 8 weeks, you may as well not have done the first one. You're not going to get any build-up of immunity. And that's because the first shot basically goes in like that, and at about the 4 to 6 week marks, he starts dropping off. So if you hit them here, it'll go like that. If you hit them here, it'll go up and carry on.